Hi, my name is George Daniel. I'm a fly fishing guide instructor and I teach at Penn State University fly fishing skills. We're here in central Pennsylvania showing you some of my home waters and talking about some of the tactics as well. So we've had kind of a cold morning. I'm still hopeful that we can maybe get some action on the surface and the fish are still active feeding below the surface. So we're gonna just start off with a dry dropper. Simple OX caddis, small little Perdigon style nymph underneath, and just start working some of these little pockets, these little seams in between the rocks and the boulders, and see what happens. We've had very low water, so going with a longer leader, trying to present the flies from a distance at first. So I think one of the most important parts when you're moving to a body of water is just taking your time. There's no need to rush. Just take your time, be quiet and be stealthy. You know, one of my favorite lines comes from a guy named Gary LaFontaine who made a comment that movement, not necessarily color, spooks fish. And what he meant by that is you can wear camo clothing, drab color clothing, but if you're making fast movements and making lots of noise, it doesn't matter what you're wearing. So I just like to just kind of take my time. And once I get in position, just chill out, just for a moment. Because the fish, they'll sense you, they'll get uneasy, but just give them a few moments. Let them kind of just regroup, calm their nerves down, and then we can target them. Now, casting a long leader with a dry dropper is not always an easy thing, but it takes a little bit of time getting used to. But anytime you can reduce line and leader on the water, it's just going to reduce the drag and just give you a much better presentation. So that's another reason why I like these Euro style fly rods. It allows you to load the rod and make these casts with virtually very little, if any, fly line outside the rod tip. I'm fishing an 11-foot 3-weight rod, and just to kind of help load the rod a little bit, even though I'm fishing a long leader, I have a 4-weight fly line, a little bit within the guides, a little bit outside the rod tip, but that mass within the rod itself kind of helps load the rod, and it literally allows me to actually cast this long leader. When you're working water like this, on streams where we're at here in central Pennsylvania, these fish, like a lot of fish, just hold really tight to the structure. Unless there's a full-blown hatch, these fish are not going to be moving very far or longer distances to chase out your flies. And I think one of the most important parts when you're working this type of water is shooting the gaps. And what I mean by that is you'll look here, we have like limestone, we have bedrock, but we have like these very narrow seams that are maybe 1 to 2 feet wide by maybe several feet to more than several feet long. But we don't want to be casting across the valley. Basically what we're trying to do is trying to place the indicator fly, or in this case a dry fly, and nymph all in the same speed current. And basically we're going to be shooting the valley, going right in the valley, casting up, allowing that fly to drift in. If you cast straight across these seams, you tend to kind of drag the fly over the currents, over the valley. And unless those fish are super happy, very active, they're not going to come up and meet you halfway. We need to kind of get down to their level. And this is where just shooting the gaps and just working these seams, placing that indicator and that nymph all in the same speed current. It's an early morning, so these are more kind of like feeding spots. These are not necessarily like the prime lie where fish may necessarily not only just feed but also go into rest. When fish are in these spots, they're usually here to feed. And if it's a cold morning like today, fish may not be awake and necessarily in these spots ready to feed. So we're just gonna kind of work this water, and then we're gonna start moving up into some more primary spots in just a few moments, hoping to find something, some resident that is awake and looking for some food. So what we have is we have a deeper spot up above. It's a nice little hydraulic cushion. Our flies are drifting, but our dry fly is drifting about the same speed as the current. The nymph I'm currently running, like a little Perdigon style. It's got like a 2.3 millimeter bead. It's just kind of riding maybe 8-10 inches below the surface. And that's fine and dandy if fish are active, they're lifting, but right now they're not. So what we're gonna do is we have a longer tip of about 20 inches. We're just going to find a similar fly and just go down or go up one bead size, give us a little bit more mass, a little bit more weight, and maybe just ride another 4 or 5 inches deeper in the water column and see what happens. But as they say, if what you're doing isn't working, make a change. There's so many times when people are fishing water, they just want to move. If they're not catching fish, they just quickly move to the next spot. When you are in a good spot like I have here, I know fish are here. I've been here so many times. I know fish are here year-round, 24/7, 365. And if you're not catching fish, then you just need to make a change. Work the levels, change your patterns, change your presentation. And if that doesn't work, then eventually move. But water like this, you could spend an hour and a half just working this bit of water right here and just making adjustments until you figure things out. So be patient. I'm just gonna move up a little bit further, kind of have a high point here, and our depression is just a little further up. I just want to be able to get in position so when I reach, I can kind of keep my rod tip and hold line leader off these faster currents and just kind of keep things laying in the softer cushion upstream here. First cast. Another thing, even when I was coaching the youth team, and I find myself guilty of this, one of I think the cardinal rules of fly fishing is never cast and walk. If you're casting and walking, this is when disaster strikes. Your body's uneven, you're moving, rocking back and forth. You're very likely to get stuck in tree branches and so forth. So I hate watching anyone cast and walk because that is usually when disaster is going to strike. So for me, accuracy and control is basically so much of it has to do with your foot. I'm not going to start casting until my feet are physically planted on the ground. If my feet are stable, my body's stable, I'm going to have control and accuracy in this presentation. So it sounds simple, it sounds so rudimentary, but don't cast until your feet are set. And then make your cast. With that long leader, longer rod like I have here, trying to keep as much line and leader off the water as I can. Give me a nice presentation. There's a nice little slot right here. And when you're reading water, you can look at the water here with a pair of polarized glasses, and what I'm looking for is you're looking for rocks, obstructions, anything like that, but also look for color changes. Color changes indicate a depth change usually. And whenever you have a change of depth where it goes from shallow to deeper or vice versa, there's often a little hydraulic cushion, a little pocket. That's where fish are going to be holding. And it doesn't take really any more than sometimes just a couple inches in depth difference, enough to create just a little bit of a cushion for that fish to hold and feed. So just target those transitions between light and dark. There we go. Right in that depth change. Nice little brown. And when you're playing fish, it's so easy to get excited. We got a little jumper there. Just maintain smooth and steady pressure. Love it. But when I'm playing the fish, if I change direction, I use my forearm and just smoothly control that rod tip. But what we don't want is a quick herky-jerky motion back and forth. Trying to maintain tension right here. Ideally, when we're landing the fish, what I'm going to try to do is just try to get the fish upstream of me. Just keep the rod tip fairly down low, keep its head underneath the water. It's going to be comfortable. You can literally slide these fish into position, and then when you're ready, you can lift the fish up, rod tip up, and let the current slide that fish right into the net for you. And right here we have just an absolutely stud of a brown trout. Gorgeous. We can also talk about something I call it's just called resetting, but it's just basically when you're fishing, you're just, as soon as you make a cast with any sort of indicator on the water, surface tension starts pulling on the nymph, so your flies don't always get down deep because there's something pulling on the surface. But all you need to do is, if you're working shallower sections of water, you make a cast, place the indicator on water, it starts pulling, your fly stays off the bottom. But if you start working like these areas where there's dips, bowls, depressions, all you simply need to do with a long rod is just basically pull the dry fly off the water, decreases the tension, and allows that fly to quickly go under, and then you just reset it on the water to work. So when you're working the dry dropper, you're fishing, it's a fairly shallow depth right here that we have. Maybe it's like 20 inches, 22 inches. So when you make a cast with a dry dropper, indicator lands, dry fly lands in the water, it immediately begins pulling the nymph downstream. So this is fine when you're fishing shallow water and you don't want your fly to ride ultra deep. But if you have a bowl or a depression, and if you want your fly to ride a little bit deeper, all we need to do is make a cast, and as soon as we go over that depression, we just simply lift the indicator off the water and then just reset it. But just that moment of pulling that dry fly off the water, it decreases the tension, allowing that nymph to just drop a few more inches deeper, and then you can just reset that dry fly on the water. But this just allows you to just reset. So when you're working the depths and getting that extra 2-3 inches below the surface is important, this is just a great tip without having to actually add additional weight or go with a longer tippet. Just simply making a cast, lifting it off the water for a moment, and then just resetting it, and then you get a little bit deeper. So it's just things to think about. When things aren't working, I try to do everything I can not to change flies, not to change tippet, and this is just one of those tips that you can do to get down just a little deeper. And I just love dry dropper fishing. This is, in water like this, like a riff, this is like a target-rich environment. This is where accuracy and control is so important. So we have this little sliver between two boulders. Maybe it's about 6 feet long. Our bowl is about 2 feet long right here. So we have this little seam right here. Casting and fishing in this water is easy and it's difficult. And what I mean by that is, if you can make a good cast and get the flies in the right spot, and if a fish is there hungry, it's going to take it probably 90% of the time. But the difficult thing here is that you have all these dynamic currents moving in every which direction. This is where your accuracy, getting the indicator and the fly to land in the exact same speed current, is incredibly important. And usually when I'm working little slivers, little seams, when possible, we're trying never to cast diagonally. What we're trying to do is hold the rod tip basically parallel to the current, and when we make this cast, we're just casting in line with the current rather than trying to cast across. So what I want is to have my dry fly land and my nymph land immediately above my dry fly, not off to the side. So I have this little seam right here, hold the rod tip off, and I want that nymph to land upstream, directly up, and you have a nice cast, good presentation where everything is in perfect alignment, giving you control, accuracy, and your presentation. If you're watching your indicator, one of the best ways of telling you that if you are not making an accurate cast, if you put your indicator or your dry fly in this case in that pocket, and all of a sudden you start seeing your dry fly get pulled in one direction, that's telling you that your nymph is literally in the faster speed current. So if you're seeing your dry fly get pulled in the opposite direction, that's just telling you that you're making an inaccurate cast. So little cast, short little strip, there's your cast, a nice level, parallel presentation. Just stalled there. Now what I'm gonna do here is make another cast, lift the dry fly, and then reset just for a moment, a little deeper. When you're working pockets, currents like this, I don't spend too much time in this particular spot, because if you make a good cast, the fish is usually going to be on it the first 3 or 4 casts. And if you feel like you've worked the water thoroughly, you've worked the depths correctly, just move on to the next spot. Cast. Another thing I love about the dry dropper is what we call a dapping technique. This is a technique that has been around since the beginning of fly fishing. You've read about it, you can read about it in Dave Juliana Berner's book, but basically what you're doing with this is that you're using the nymph as an anchor, and what we're going to do is that nymph's going to hold the rig tight to the water. And when you have caddis and a lot of your insects, female insects that are coming down to lay their eggs, you'll see the caddis in particular like bouncing their ass off the water, and what the female is doing is just using that friction or that tension to kick the eggs off her body onto the water. And fish, when they're eating egg-laying caddis, they're looking for that bouncing technique. So with this technique, we can make a cast, let that nymph anchor, and we can just basically just take your index finger, and then you could just literally just tap the index finger and just getting that fly and a little bit of a lift, but it just looks like a little caddis that is just laying her eggs on the water. So a lot of times with your presentation with dry fly techniques, it's not always about a dead drift, it's about imitating what's natural. And I think another great thing about when you look at caddis and a lot of your insects that are hatching, when they're coming down to lay their eggs, they're not always floating. Sometimes they're trying to go against the current. And I think a dry dropper, whether you're drifting it naturally or actually imparting motion into that cast, that nymph that's anchored and it's kind of holding that dry fly back. It's actually slowing the speed down, and often that is the speed that the insect, the female, is actually moving when they're laying their eggs. So I think, especially when you have egg-laying insects, the dry dropper technique allows your dry fly to actually look sometimes more natural floating than what it would be just floating by itself. So just a couple thoughts to think about. And when you're casting, I think one of the most important things about casting, it's about accuracy. And it's just when you're trying to move, one of the things you're trying to do is from the end of the drift to the beginning of the drift, I'm trying not to rotate my shoulders back and forth, trying to quickly go back under. One, you're going to spook fish, but then two, when your body is curving, you are literally throwing a curve. You're going to put the nymph in one direction, and as your body keeps moving, you're going to put the dry fly in a different direction. Again, your feet, this is so important, but it's so important that once you get in position, I try to get squared up. Hand forward, and then I make my cast, but hand isn't forward, so it's like line of sight. If you're trying to go accurately, if you're trying to if you're shooting a rifle or a pistol, we're not in the wild west where we're shooting off the hip. I think the most accurate way you can make a cast is with a line of sight with your hands in front. We don't need a lot of power. This is a short cast, so we don't need to use a full range leverage with our body and our hand. All we need to do is have the hand out, thumb or index finger, and then just line of sight, draw a line from your eye to your target, and make your cast. But hand here, there's your cast. You make this beautiful, perfect cast in that seam and current each and every time. And this is really the key to this type of water. It's just accurately positioning the fly where you want it to go. And we have a bunch of boulders and just a little drop right here, hand over, a little flip. We're going to drop it right in that boulder or on the boulder, pop, hold it. Now, lots of vegetation. Always check your flies. Cast and drop it right in that seam. The thing I'm learning more and more, my mentor, Mr. Humphreys, always talked about just using a short casting stroke. And what he meant by that is casting, for the most part, it's about speed, not always about power, even though power is sometimes a needed item in casting. But when your elbow is bent, when you're making your cast, whether you're using the thumb or the finger on top, if your hand can travel in a short, straight, compact movement, you get more speed by doing this than what you do by trying to straighten out your hand and go in this wide motion by force. You actually slow down when you're going in this curve. If I can just keep my hand nice and tight and make a short, compact motion, that's speed. This is how you can make this cast and make that cast work with basically minimal amount of effort. And not only that, when you're able to get close to your fish, the less movement you're able to make, the more stealthier you become, and a lot easier your presentations become in this environment. So again, long-winded answers and comments about casting, but these are just some of the bedrock principles that I think are just so important when you're working dry dropper, but also when you're working such a short, tight, confined environment. There we go. It's always nice when they cooperate. Get him on the reel, or her on the reel. When you're playing a fish, if you feel that head jolting down, that means the fish is usually, the angle of the fish is actually downward, and that's advantage fish. So when you feel that rod tip jerking, getting pulled, maintain light tension, and then the moment that fish kind of starts calming down, oops, maybe not. There we go. So again, nice and smooth. Maintain nice tension. And smaller fish like this, when you feel a fish relax, time to bring it in to the net. But this is just where, again, accuracy and control. These are, I don't want to say it's easy, but if you can make a good cast in these spots, fish are going to cooperate usually. It's another wild brown.